Hey G Session viewers, my name is Alyssa Kritzman and I'm the design director for G Project, which is a public art campaign transforming negative ideas about immigrants. Because after all, we are all immigrants. Everyone has a personal journey and story about how their family found themselves in the US. Like myself, I'm a G1 on my father's side and then a G2 on my mother's side. So what does that mean? G0 means you came from elsewhere. G1, your parents were born elsewhere and you were born here. G2 is that your parents were born here, but their parents were born elsewhere, and so forth. So for season 3, we are very excited because we are inviting our previous G Session guests to invite someone that they know and interview them to ask the big question: what is your G status? The cool thing about this is we are now creating a web of immigrant stories that are truly connected through storytelling and personal artifacts. So without further ado, please have a listen to today's session. And at the end of the video, my colleague, Richard Pelzer, will let you know how you can participate and keep up with our project.
Thanks, Alyssa, and welcome back to another G Sessions. My name is Kevyn Fairchild, and I'm very happy today to be joined by a very good friend of mine, Althea Stevens. And Althea is a co-host of the On the Run NYC podcast and is also a candidate for City Council for District 16 in the Bronx. So welcome, Althea.
Hello. Hi, Kevyn.
Hi, welcome to the G Sessions.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So let's start from the beginning. What is your G status?
You know, G status sounds real sexy. Let me tell you, I like the way that sounds. But so my G status, my mom was born in St. Thomas, but her mother was born in Tatola, which is part of the British Virgin Islands. So her mother was an immigrant, whereas though she technically isn't, because the U.S. Virgin Islands is a territory of the United States. So it's very weird and very messy. And then her father is Puerto Rican, which is also territory of the United States. So I'm not really sure what my G status is.
Yeah, that's fair. And it becomes very complicated when you start talking about territories and because I think a lot of people also think of like Puerto Ricans as immigrants, but they're actually Americans. And so, that.
And I mean, and then my dad, he's from the South, his roots go back to Georgia. So, and he's like his sister and him, and they're half Cherokee and half Black. It's just all over the place. So, I have a little bit of everything in me.
That sounds great. Talk about growing up. I mean, what was that like, having all those different influences on you growing up?
It's really interesting. I mean, although my mother and father are still together, they've been together for the last, I think it's 43 years at this point. Crazy. Wow. I could not imagine being with somebody that long, but they're still together. But we grew up with very strong West Indian influences. So it's so interesting. Like, people are always surprised to hear that I'm actually part Puerto Rican, because my mother's father is Puerto Rican. But because we grew up and my grandfather died when my mother was a child, and my grandmother moved to America with her new husband, that was kind of our influences, like West Indian and having a very Caribbean background. And then also the influences from my father, who was from the South.
So if you thinking back, can you think of a time in your life where you really became very conscious of cultural differences here in America, in terms of like between yourself and others, or encountering another culture?
I mean, I grew up in Harlem, and I grew up at a very interesting time. Like, it was in the 80s. And so for me, I remember being very young and looking around, and everyone looked like me. And so for me, I just kind of assumed that everyone was Black. And then over time, the neighborhood started to change, and we had more Latinos moving into the neighborhood and into the community. And then that's when, I always knew we had Puerto Rican roots, but that's when I started to gravitate towards more to oh, that is a part of me too. And embracing salsa and merengue and hanging out with folks and getting more in tune with the foods. But it's funny because I remember I always thought we all eat the same food. It's just seasoned different. Because I remember going to my friends' houses, and it would be the same thing, but it just be seasoned different or presented a little bit differently. We were all eating the same things. We was all eating rice. We was all eating beans and chicken. It was all the same thing, right? But just presented in a very different way. But I grew up, it was still very diverse. And I mean, I think because of all the different influences, like in my family, I was always just very cognizant of it. But I had an uncle who was a Black Panther in the 60s. And so he always was teaching me about my culture, my history. So I always had this very, very good sense of Black pride and like being comfortable in my skin, although I wasn't. But that was just something that was just always instilled in me. We would always have conversations about it while I was still trying to figure out more about like my Puerto Rican side, my West Indian side, and getting more in touch with that as well. But also, you know, I've always just really related to being Black American. I think sometimes that gets overshadowed as if it's something different because I was born here. So like I said, my grandma was born in the British Virgin Islands. My mother was born in St. Thomas and my dad was born in Georgia, but I was born in New York. So, you know, for me, I've always identified as Black American.
What is the idea of being an immigrant mean to you? What are the things that you think about?
You know, I always think about my grandmother because, you know, I remember when she was taking her citizenship tests to like go and her just studying and just wanting to be a part of American culture. And my grandma, she's like, my mom came here when she was 13, but my grandma's the only one that still has her accent. Like my mom and her siblings, they all pretty much lost their accent, but my grandmother always still has her accent. And for me, just being an immigrant is just like trying to hold on to your connection, right? Especially with like Black folks and people of color. That's part of who we are because with slavery, so much was stolen from us. Like there's a lot of cultures where they can like trace their history back 200-300 years because they have this lineage. But people who are of Black and brown descent, we don't have that luxury because we were ripped from our country. So I think that it's always important and thinking about when I think about immigrants and things like that, it's about holding on to our culture and having pride in that culture and kind of continuing to keep those traditions going.
Yeah, that's important also for the diaspora as well, like understanding like where, like being able to trace back family or understanding something beyond than just what you necessarily presented with, right? And this idea of like connection and identity back to a culture that you don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly what it is. It's like, I think that's why immigrants are so important and like a part of our culture, because the reality situation is, especially like a lot of Black and brown people in America, we are so diverse, right? A lot of us come from so many different backgrounds. And I think it's just always important to try to connect to those different places that we don't necessarily have a full understanding of.
Absolutely. So you're running for city council in the Boogie Down Bronx, as you're fond of saying.
And it's also a very diverse borough, honey. We do things over here.
So what inspired you to take that leap?
So I've been in youth development for the last 20 years. And to be honest, the young people that I serve were the ones who sparked this in me to run for office. So, you know, for me, it's about how do we get young people engaged in politics again and excited about it. I think for a long time, young people just felt disconnected and nobody cared. And for me, this run has always been about like getting young people engaged and a part of the process and owning their power. We can't sit here and criticize things if we're not part of it. So for me, it's about making sure that every voice is heard and every voice is a part of that conversation and making sure everyone has a seat at the table.
And if you were to think of just a couple of issues that are really important for you, what would those be?
I mean, you know, I'm running on a very, very clear platform of housing for all, youth development, obviously, and food insecurities, because in the Bronx we have major food insecurities and things like that. But for me, to be honest, a lot of those things are all connected, can go back to youth development, right? When we think about young people not having homes and how that affects their lives in their education, right? In my district specifically, we have the most concentration of young people who are in transitional homes, which is a huge problem. And this pandemic has highlighted how much of a problem that is, right? We have young people who don't have access to Wi-Fi. We have young people who are not knowing where they're going to go or have a place to stay. So, you know, housing is a human right. You know, we have to make sure that people have permanent homes, right? Even thinking about youth development, we have to invest in our kids. Education is a piece of that, but we also need to have other investments in our young people to make sure that they become productive adults. And the only way we can do that is by making sure that they have mentorships, they have after school programs, they have enrichment programs and things that really nourish them as a whole, and also have social services and address some of the trauma that they face on a regular basis. And even when we think about food security, right? Like families are working 2 or 3 jobs and still not able to bring home money to feed their families, right? Then we have kids showing up to schools hungry. And with this pandemic and schools being closed and not having access to food has been a huge problem. So my platform was always about how do we make sure that we are providing for our next generation and making sure that they're okay. And I think all of those things are connected.
Is there something about the way that you grew up that you sort of think about when you're looking at your approach to running for office or being a member of city council?
You know, I was always a very outspoken kid. Like, I don't know if people could tell. I was always very outspoken, but I was outspoken because I never really felt heard. So for me, I think that that's why I've been running on this platform for young people, because I don't want people to feel silenced the way I felt, although it might not necessarily been the case. And I just believe that we have to be engaged. Like I said, my uncle, he was a Black Panther, and he talked to me about just the stuff that they did and how they moved programs, right? When we talk about like free lunch programs and all those things, that was started by the Black Panthers. A lot of people just don't know that, right? Like when we talk about health clinics and those things were started by a grassroots organization, and they made the government look bad. So they said, oh, I guess we should probably do this as well. So it's things like that where it's like you can make a difference. And that was something that I always felt in my heart that could be happening. Like if you saw something or something was wrong, that you needed to speak up and you had the opportunity to make a difference. So I think that that was something that was just instilled in me from like having those conversations with him and just always being able to have the range to be able to speak out about what I felt wasn't right.
And on the subject of speaking out, on the Run NYC, we're going to have your co-host Amoy on a future episode, but talk a little bit about the podcast.
Listen, the podcast we started because I met Amoy at a training, and I met her and she was in tears crying because she was like, I don't know if I should run. And I was feeling the same way she felt. And we just really started this journey together of like, how do we support each other and get each other across the finish line? And we wanted to make the process transparent. I'm not in politics. Like I said in the start of this, I've been in youth development for the last 20 years. So because I've been in youth development for 20 years, I don't know the ins and outs of politics. I've been doing advocacy and advocate work and doing that part, but I didn't know how to run a campaign or where to start or what connections I needed to make. And so if I felt this way, it's my duty to ensure that the next person running, it's a little bit easier for them. So we started on the Run NYC so that we can make this process transparent. We have guests on that talks about politics in a very different light. And also too, like there's not a lot of shows where Black women are talking about politics and living in their truth. And so for me, that's also a plus too. Like we're always going to live in our truth and say what we mean and say how we want to say it and let it be heard. So I'm just really excited. So those who don't know, you can check out our podcast on the Run NYC. We air every other week, and check out our episode.
So I understand you brought an object with you that you would like to share with us. What is that object?
So because, like I said, a lot of people just don't know what I am. And this is representation of me in so many sense. Like every year I go to the West Indian Day Parade. Obviously I didn't go this year because it was COVID, but I typically go and I have both my Caribbean flags, right? So this is my VI flag, woo! But I also rep my Puerto Rican flag, right? Like this is really who I am, and this is really a part of me. So I just wanted to go. Most people haven't seen this flag ever before in their life. Like they ain't never seen a Virgin Island flag, but we real, we there, and we got land, and we doing it too, right? So respect us. So you see the bird, you see the eagle and the VI.
I love it. It's a great flag. I don't think I actually have
a flag, but they don't know the VI flag. So I wanted to bring it out so people could see it and rep my granny and my mommy, because that's where they're at, and that's where our family house is at in the Virgin Islands.
Love it. Well, thank you so much. If people want to find out more about you, support you, or how can they find you?
They can look me up on my website. Is Althea4citycouncil.org. That once again is Althea, ALTHEA, the number 4 citycouncil.org.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much for joining us. And I'm Absolutely. And I'm going to pass things over to Richard. Thanks again.
Wow, what a great story. Thank you very much for sharing. My name is Richard Pelzer. I'm the Director of Communications and Marketing for the G Project. As my business partner, Alyssa Chrisman, mentioned in the beginning, we are a public art project. I would love to invite everyone to our website, which is gproject.org. And I ask you to please sign up for all of our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and now this new YouTube channel. If you are new to our YouTube channel, I ask everyone to please subscribe right there below. And we would love to actually hear any comments. So please catch us every Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for a new story. And we ask you to please share your project. And we ask the question, what is your G status? Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you soon.